What disturbing thing did you learn about someone only after their death? Apparently this story is not uncommon. Brother-in-law's best friend rang him distraught after going through his recently deceased, much older sister's papers. He had discovered that she wasn't his sister as he had thought for the last 70 years, she was his mother. Usual story, teenage pregnancy, went to a convent to have the baby, gave it to mom to bring up. He apparently had a good relationship with her, and he was upset because she couldn't tell him the truth. I received a phone call from my late husband's girlfriend the day of his funeral. She was phoning his cell phone which I had turned off while he was in the hospital. She told me that my husband had been paying her rent for the last year. The bank had recently foreclosed on our house. I had no idea he was unfaithful to me, but she knew all about me. I once had a friend whose dad died. And he never really talked about it, but he was pretty troubled. Every year on his death date, they would have a celebration of life party. He invited our friend group one year and we were all excited to be there to support him. Turns out his dad died in a car accident involving a drunk driver. The dad was the drunk driver and also killed the family he hit. We kinda brought it up to him to see how he really felt about everything and he defended his dad. I understand that's a hard situation because you lost your dad. But your dad also killed a whole family. I'm not friends with him anymore. For a different reason. But that helped in my decision to break our friendship. He was very troubled. That weekend we were with him for the celebration. He ended up sexually assaulting my best friend. But no one but me and her know about it. Obviously she isn't friends with him either. My buddy's mom totally killed my buddy's dad. She had taken a $200,000 life insurance policy out on him 6 months before he died, and he died from not taking his medication that he'd taken no problem all of his life. My buddy was away for the weekend so wasn't home when his dad died. After his mom died, we found out she'd taken a life insurance policy out on my buddy at some point too, and she'd also forged his signature to sign over $100,000 my buddy's dad had left to him. She also faked illnesses to get prescription drugs and had little books filled with info on what she'd sold and how much she'd made from selling them. After my grandfather's death we were cleaning out his old house and I found an envelope with paperwork that basically said my dad had died by suicide. I had been told as a kid that it was a heart attack. It was a sad way to find out the truth. My brother-in-law died in an accident, and his wife found out by going through his phone that he was sleeping with several other women. Many of whom were pretty close in our friend group and some were also married. It was quite awkward and got pretty messy. One of my best friends died suddenly and clearly didn't have a chance to clean up his affairs beforehand. He had little family so the group of friends handled everything. We found child porn in his house. Not just a few pieces or somehow accidental. It was in a file cabinet with folders and sorted by ages, sex, etc. This changed everything. That's simply not acceptable. Not acceptable sounds like an understatement, but it was actually the other way. It was just nope. No excuses, no trying to understand, no worries about his family or their reputations or his or anything, no anything. It was instantly done and over, and he was labeled with the scarlet letter. We called the police in a matter of seconds. I literally puked that night over it. My dad had sole control over all family finances. We definitely didn't live in poverty, by any means, but he stressed my mom out about bills and sudden expenses and stuff all the time, by claiming we were tight on money, or running out of money, or he wasn't making as much at the moment, etc. He's go as far as claiming we could lose the house, lose the cars, he might lose his job soon, we might not be able to pay the bills, oh no. Yeah, he had a ton of money secretly stashed away in a separate bank account and was living lavishly on his business trips. There was never any danger to our possessions and way of life. He said those things and started those arguments for the sick pleasure of causing my mom pain and stress, and feeling powerful. And maybe for the thrill of having a secret. Who knows for sure, I guess. I had a brother who had some paranoid delusions, FBI, CIA following him, spying on his apartment, etc. We, my brothers and I, had tried to get him help and he would just have no part of it. After a few years, it seemed like it had gotten better. He stopped bringing it up and we felt like it must have just passed. After he died, we found his journal and it was just horrifying. Right up until the night he died, he detailed all of the torture that they were inflicting on him, weird stuff that I can't even write in here. It was just incredibly disturbing to read what a tortured life he was living inside his mind while acting relatively normal outside. That my grandfather molested my mom when she was a child. It started after my grandmother died and ended after he found someone else. I was pretty shocked, especially since my mom didn't seem to carry any kind of baggage from it, though of course I don't know what went and still goes on in her head. Something that made sense though was how she always made sure my brother and I were either in her room to sleep whenever we stayed at Grandpa's place, which wasn't too often, or in the room next to hers. We were never alone with my grandfather, and we never had a warm or loving relationship with him. He was cold to us and we never really got attached to him, and we visited him maybe once a year. I think my mom felt obligated to have a relationship with him for some reason, but she was always very protective of us, and my brother and I were never victims of his. I went through a nasty breakup with my oldest kid's mom that lasted several years. We were never married and she was crazy as hell, so she told the hospital she didn't know our kid's father just so she could have leverage over me. You know, like a sane person does. Years later and after several investigations into child abuse, she lost custody. Over the next several years we kept getting oddly specific complaints about things going on in my house and my daughter and her stepmom specifically. Dumb shit like matching clothes or details about how we do time out. My mom died 2 years ago, and when we switched her Facebook to memorial mode I saw that she had been talking bad about me for years to my ex and was essentially spying on me for her and twisting information. I'm guessing it's because she felt bad for a mother that lost her kid, but it was still a penis move. It's been 2 years and I still refuse to visit her grave with my siblings and haven't shed a tear for her since. I had a great aunt and great uncle who were full-time missionaries in Africa. After they died, 3 of their grandchildren finally felt safe enough to share that my great aunt and uncle had molested them. Someone replied, if they molested them, then they almost certainly were molesting children on their missions. My wife works in developmental aid and has done work in Central Africa. Once she began working for larger companies, she told me that they have to be extremely careful about who travels to Africa to help out, volunteers, donors, etc., because there is a business, yes, business, in Westerners traveling to third world countries and assaulting children because it is more difficult to get caught. I remember not believing her at first because I didn't believe that humans could be so depraved, but once you realize that it is extremely common, your innocence gets shattered. Not really disturbing, but definitely raised some questions. When my great-grandmother passed away last year, we found a photo album she had hidden in a closet that was full of photos from World War II. We don't know for sure because she never talked about it, but from the photos it looked like my great-grandfather was a Nazi, and they lived quite the lavish life during the war. It caused a bit of a rift in the family, but still, we don't know the actual facts. We do know that my great-grandfather was captured in France, and when the war ended they came to Canada. Neither of them ever talked about the details. That they didn't die when we thought? Here's the deal. My mom was raised by her mom, now 92, and an evil old bat, and her stepfather, who molested her. Where was Dad? Died when she was 11, allegedly. That's what my grandmother said. This would have been around 1961. Flash forward to 2015 and my sister is doing genealogy work on the family. Finds out not only did my biological grandfather not die in 1961, he died in 2005. And had 5 more daughters, one of which he gave the same name as my mom. So my mom got cheated out of a potential relationship with her dad by her liar of a mom, who moved and remained hidden from her ex, my mom's real dad. My grandmother moved down to Texas from Virginia to stay in a nursing home and basically make my mom and dad's life hell. We went to visit one weekend and she came over for dinner. And I dropped the bomb on her that we'd figured out she'd been full of it for 50 years. She then had the nerve to act offended. My dad told her to shut the hell up. It's disturbing in a way. My great-grandmother went into the military after committing a crime, and in the military she confessed to a judge who punished her by extending her military contract and forcing her to serve in the war. I never knew what happened until way after she died, and I had asked my dad about it. There was a pedophile in her neighborhood who was touching kids and he was going after boys. My mama mutilated his wank and beat the crap out of him when she saw him try to lift 2 boys. That not only did grandfather physically, emotionally, and sexually abuse me, but also my mother and 2 aunts. And my grandmother knew the whole time and had been confronted by all of them about it, and she did nothing. I still can't look at her the same to this day. He's dead, but the memories aren't, and she refuses to talk about it to this day. I had the best grandpa growing up. Like typical movie grandpa. He was perfect. Spoiled us like crazy, great corny jokes, always had crazy silly stories. Always saved the day. Just the best man I knew. After he passed, one of my aunts told me and my little sister he had cheated on my grandma with her own sister multiple times. We never knew. Wish she never told us. My grandma, Dad's mom, was one of my favorite people before she died when I was 14. She was extremely sweet, generous, and gave good advice. My brother and I stayed with her and were alone with her all the time, and she never mistreated us or in any way acted unusual. I found out only a couple weeks ago at 33 years old that she was a severe alcoholic who would get drunk almost daily up until her death. My dad said she would beat him and his brothers when they were kids, and as adults would still say severely psychologically abusive taunts while grinning at their faces. I never had even the slightest inclination, and this is coming from someone who grew up with an alcoholic stepdad and a near-alcoholic mom. Found out that my cousin's stepfather had been diddling them, 4 kids, their entire childhoods. Guy died by suicide by cop. There were questions how he went out that way, and the entire thing came to light. Within a week, one of the kids committed suicide after the other traumatized siblings blamed him, saying it was his fault people found out and Dad got killed. When I was 14, my aunt died very suddenly. She was only 37, but she had a lot of health problems, overly obese, drug abuse, alcoholism, etc. As a family, we had tried our best to encourage her to get healthier, but disappointingly, she never listened to us. Nonetheless, she was always happy. Smiling, laughing, always complimenting me and saying how much she loved our family. I never understood why someone with such cheer and utter happiness could end up in the situation she was in. While I was spending the night with a distant cousin of mine, we got into a deep conversation about my aunt. We both spoke our feelings about the death, including my confusion for why she had so many problems. My cousin looked at me with an "oh no, you don't know?" kind of look. I asked what happened, but she hesitated. She asked me to not tell anyone I heard it from her. I said of course, and pushed her to tell me. She explained how when my aunt was about 17, her mom, my grandma, had just gotten married to another man. His brother, let's call him T, was very close with my aunt. Apparently they went out to ice cream and looked at fancy cars that he promised to buy her. When my cousin was telling me this, I was confused, because it's just an uncle and niece type of thing. Why is that so bad? Well, one night, my aunt had to spend the night at T's house while her parents worked graveyard. My cousin didn't exactly know what happened, but it was heavily implied and speculated that they slept together, or even worse, he assaulted her. This was because after that night, my aunt asked to spend the night over and over again. She basically begged to see T every day. T and her parents eventually got tired of it and said that she wasn't allowed to go over there again. T never acted the same around her. He ignored her at family events, didn't take her out anymore, and never brought her up or even talked about her in conversations. After that, my aunt struggled to find a real boyfriend and even tried experimenting with girls. She never knew what real love was, and it was obvious that it bugged her. She had been played with by this tool and left in the dust. She eventually got a husband and had my favorite cousin that I love so much. But life wasn't kind to her. And I guess doing drugs and drinking her life away was her way to cope. It hurts to think that she passed thinking that she was nothing but a waste, when in reality, she was a blessing to everyone who came in contact with her. It's been 3 years since she passed and I miss her dearly. I wish I could tell her how much I love and appreciated her. My mother had a teenage pregnancy that resulted in a stillborn. None of us knew. I know for a fact my father didn't. I decided not to tell him. One of my favorite uncles was suspected by his own daughter of being a pedophile. That, I have a hard time believing for a great many reasons. But, I'll never know for many reasons. My cousin before his murder had asked his father to build him a rough box if he passed away. He was 33 years old. His final words will haunt me as they were said to a witness, "I'm really cold and want to go home." Most recently, my father died. I believe he knew he was sicker than he let on, and didn't want to worry me. He had been reaching out to people he hadn't spoke to in years and just telling them how much they meant to him. He didn't commit suicide, he had a stroke. The hardest part about these things is that in my parents' case, they had these secret sorrows that I knew little about. In their way, they shielded us from the truth, but it's in vain when you find out the truth from someone else. My cousin, only a few months older than me, mid-30s, died tragically in really unexpected circumstances. We weren't hugely close, but it was a real shock and has really messed up her immediate family. About 6 months after she died, I found out that my police officer brother had randomly pulled her over, not knowing it was her, and breath tested her for alcohol, mandatory for every traffic stop where I live, and she was well over the limit and thus had drink driving charges brought against her. This was about a year before she died. But, because she and her family are kind of stuck up and perfect, not the type of people to accept that they might be alcoholics, they tried to claim my brother made the reading up because of a non-existent family grudge and tried to have him charged with misconduct etc. and fired. It wasn't successful but made his life pretty miserable for a while. Her family don't know I know, but you can imagine that I'm pretty conflicted over telling them how messed up they are versus recognizing the impact her death has had on them and not adding to their troubles. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more videos. Click the right box for the Creepy Reddit videos playlist. Share your own stories in the comments below. Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Within moments, baby was born. But baby was limp, blue, and not breathing. Emergency service dispatchers, what is the scariest call you have ever gotten? One of the first calls I ever took. Woman calls up and asks about the process of filing a restraining order. She discusses how her boyfriend has been abusive and controlling. Mid-conversation the doorbell rings, she puts me on hold, opens the door and I hear yelling. Guy barges in and starts beating on her and I'm sitting there helpless listening, because I didn't have her address yet. Luckily, I did have her name and within a few minutes we got her address and got help to her. She was pretty badly injured but lived, and he is still in jail. That call made me doubt myself and if I was in the right profession, but I stuck with it and it has been a very rewarding, though sometimes sad, profession. One that always sticks with me is the guy who phoned to tell me he'd shot himself in the head. He was slurring his words and sounded drunk. But no, he'd actually shot himself in the head and was dead by the time the crew got there. That was a weird one to get my head around. I also took a call from a 15-year-old kid who came home from school to find his dad hanging. So I had to basically ask him if he was cold, could he cut him down, all the usual while this poor kid was panicking to hell. And then the kid stops answering my questions. And the dispatcher next to me gets the emergency call from the neighbors saying they don't know what's going on, but there's a kid standing in the street just screaming. I think about that poor kid a lot, and I absolutely detest his father for doing that to him, when he knew his son would be the one who'd find him. Probably the other one that stands out is the call from the woman who'd just been raped. She'd been coming home from a club, and someone had pushed through her door behind her as she unlocked it. When he left, she called me. I still remember the way she screamed when she heard knocking on her door again. And I had to yell at her to try to make her understand it was the police, and not the guy coming back. I didn't sleep well after that night shift at all. Caller, muffled voice. Me, I can't understand you, what's the location of the emergency? The caller sounds clearer, like Kermit the Frog. He gives his address and says, I'm going to hang myself. Me, sir, we can help you, talk to me? What's been happening? Caller, I just want you to move my body before my family get back. Me, please, there's nothing that can't be. Crack gargling silence. I had to stay on the line until I heard police on scene. He had a hands-free kit on. I wasn't even allowed 5 minutes break. I had a breakdown after. I can't describe those sounds. Haunts me to this day. I cannot describe the feeling of being so intimately involved in the moment of such a traumatic death. He gave his pain to me. Suicidal calls and death were common. Part of a job. But this was so sudden, I was the last voice he heard. Also it was 2 a.m. on Christmas Day. I was wearing a Santa hat. Looking forward to seeing my family. I had to cancel and went home, spend the day alone and shaking. I can't share this with people I know, I don't want to spread his pain further. Now I have PTSD. Yay. I am an emergency helicopter dispatcher, so I get calls from EMS in rural areas. First question I always ask is, what is the closest city to the scene? I swear 80% of these people do not know how to pronounce it correctly, and 50% of them do not know how to spell it. One time this guy cut his penis off on bath salts. When he came to, he realized what he did and called us directly. I work for a sheriff's office and a good friend of mine was a dispatcher. I stepped outside one day for a smoke and my buddy was standing there shaking and crying. I asked him what was wrong and he told me that he had just dispatched a call for his best friend. His friend was a former Army sniper and had only been out for a few months. He was a volunteer firefighter and was responding to a house fire, rolled the truck, and had been decapitated. Guy had 5 young daughters. Was a 911 operator for 10 years. Scariest is probably different than worst. My scariest was an active shooter in a high-rise. Just sitting on the line trying to give the best directions so everyone makes it out okay. My worst were these two. When I first started out, I worked for a rural county and some areas were very far from help. One night I got a call from a group of people who were in an accident and their car caught fire. The girl I was speaking with was stuck in her seatbelt and as the fire spread she was in terrible amounts of pain. She kept begging me to send help but it was far away. I stayed with her until the phone dropped, assuringly the phone and it melted or malfunctioned. The other was a hanging. The father called me for a welfare check and I was putting in the call when he got to the house. He said the door was unlocked, so I stayed landline while he went inside and he found his son. The pain in the moment he walked out and told his wife was so horrible and raw. A woman called, screaming her head off, that she had driven into a body of water, her car was filling up with water, she couldn't open the door, she didn't know where she was, etc. Kids in the car, we're all going to die. Meanwhile I'm like, what the hell do I do now? Try to find out details about where she is. We know she can see a massive shopping center but it could be anywhere even remotely close to that. Local units all fan out to the different large ponds and streams it could be. Call the Coast Guard and Marine support units to help. Try to find out what kind of body of water it is, how big it is, etc., and she is just too panicked to answer any questions whatsoever. Managed to get the registration off her vehicle and that was it. Turned out she had driven into a flooded road, flooded from rain, not anywhere near an actual body of water. Absolutely zero danger of the water going past her knees. A 3-year-old was at a campground with her family and they let her out of their sight for 20 seconds and she wandered down to a creek and drowned. Her mom found her and her father called in. While I was getting details from the understandable distraught father, a random guy camping there was doing CPR and managed to resuscitate her. I can't imagine how her parents felt, but it was like physical weight being lifted off of me. My sister works as a dispatcher. Her first week on the job, she had a man call in, saying he was going to kill himself. He told her that she couldn't do anything to change his mind, he was simply trying to let her know where he could be found. She heard the gunshot through the call. Second one, she had a little girl call in because her dad was unresponsive. She knew that CPR would likely save this man, but the daughter wasn't grown enough and didn't have the strength to perform it effectively. My sister had to tell her to leave the room, because the longer that girl stayed in there trying fruitlessly to save her father, the more scarred she would become by the experience of watching her father die. I think the most genuine terror comes from child callers. I had this 5-year-old call in that her dad was growling and wouldn't wake up. Okay, agonal breathing, probably a heart attack, scrambling to get a confirmed address for EMS. PD dispatched to unconfirmed address. Finally confirm the address and start giving directions on CPR. Nope, she will not touch him because she is scared, then bursts into tears. Luckily PD arrived just after she refused and they were able to do CPR until EMS arrived. 911 dispatcher here for a large city. I get a little bit of everything and mostly it's BS. But one that stuck with me was something recently. A man called in frantic and it was really hard to get him to calm down. He told me his 35-year-old girlfriend was unresponsive and not breathing. I immediately started giving this guy CPR instructions and he kept screaming, I'm sorry my love." Tough morning for the guy, no doubt. It hit me that he could have been responsible or the last thing he ever said to her was not pleasant. Never followed up on the call. In this line of work, it's on to the next one. Too busy to think about it. I have millions of people depending on me not to let the last call affect the next one. I don't know what happened other than she was a DOA. Didn't hit me until the next day. My God, that scream was deafening. All I know is there was more to the story, I could hear it in his voice. Peace. I've heard people shot in real time, parents trying to revive their dead kids first thing in the morning, but this for some reason hit me. Not a dispatcher, but one told me that one time he got a call from a 19-year-old girl. It was late and she was new to driving, in the US. Her car slipped on black ice and went over the bridge. Her car sank in the river and she called 911 and he received it. He tried to keep her calm. Poor girl was an au pair from the same country in Africa. She was crying because she was going to die in a foreign country, and to make things worse she didn't even know where she was. They couldn't find her fast enough. The dispatch even remembers her last words: "Tell my sister I'm sorry I left." This story haunts me to this day. I'm also an au pair. Call came in and was flagged as a frequent caller on the ass end of a very rural county. The dude was just screaming. We couldn't make out anything he was saying, but we had his address and sent every available unit we had. After a while the screaming started to die down and his breathing got very labored. He wouldn't talk to us, but he just kept muttering. After a few minutes we realized he was praying. Few minutes later deputy arrived on scene. Heard him check in on scene and also heard him on the line. First noise I heard was him vomiting. Turned out the dude had been working on his car and the lift collapsed. The guy was in under the car but was between it and a tree when the car started rolling. He was impaled on a branch and pinned between the tree and car. Dude lived. He's a quadriplegic but he's alive. First legit 911 call he ever made, and everyone took their sweet time getting there because it was usually nonsense. I worked as a jailer for a while after getting out of the Marines. We had a dispatcher who had 2 kids. Both boys, one a posse that was always in jail, the other younger, troubled and riding a dangerous line. She got the call one night that her younger son got shot twice in a drug deal gone wrong at a public park where he was playing ball. He was dead before the helicopter got in the air, most likely. The dispatch center was connected to the jail where she had to work, less than 50 yards from the man who shot her son. She was pretty tore up. There was an accident once on a somewhat busy state road here. An older couple in an SUV pulled out onto the road without seeing a motorcyclist that was going well over 100 miles per hour. He rear-ended them, died instantly and plowed through the SUV, landing halfway through the windshield. The SUV flipped a couple times and landed on the passenger side, trapping the wife. Then it caught on fire. At my dispatch center we had 3 of us working at all times, and I don't even know how many 911 calls we instantly got when this happened. Dozens, I'm sure. After that I sent the fire department and they got on the way. This is a rural area and this intersection was probably a good 10 minutes south of them. Some bystanders managed to get the husband out of the SUV, but he died in the helicopter on the way to the hospital, I believe. The wife burned alive. Honestly, the worst part was right after I dispatched the FD. One of the lieutenants on the biggest police department in my county happened to be driving through there with his family and he called 911. I'll never forget how panicked and frantic he was on that call. I had never heard any of our officers like that before, let alone one of the administrators. We were pretty friendly with all of them, so it shook me up. After I hung up with him I just started sobbing. Not a dispatcher myself, but the worst call I've heard of involved 2 friends of mine. James was a cop that had been a 911 dispatcher before he got his badge. Al was my former roommate. After I moved out of state, he moved in with James. At the time of this story, James was recovering from an injury and took a shift at dispatch because they were short-staffed. He got a call that very matter-of-factly said, "I am going to shoot myself, please send someone to address to collect my body." He's a little freaked because that's his address. It was Al. He tried to talk him out of it and was still on the phone when Al pulled the trigger. It messed him up for a while. My mother worked dispatch and got a call from a woman whose husband had been locked in a trailer and lit it on fire. The windows had been boarded up and there was no way for her to get out. This was in the 90s, so landline. The call cut out when the cords started to burn. By the time fire and police arrived it was too late. The best she got was from a woman who was in very active labor. My mom had to talk her and her teenage daughter through delivering the baby. By the time EMS got there they had a healthy baby boy. Obligatory, not an emergency dispatcher. I had a conversation with one once where we discussed his craziest work stories, and his was taking the call of a man who had just drowned his 2 small daughters in a lake near their house. He had to stay on the phone with his sociopath, asking him questions about the time and location of the murders, until the police arrived to take him into custody. He never did find out if they ever found the children or if either of them survived in the end. I've come into contact with a fair number of sexual predators and child molesters in my line of work, but I never had to interact with them immediately after their crimes and press them for details. It's a lot to ask of someone. I've always had a lot of respect for emergency dispatchers and the folks who run abuse, rape, and suicide hotlines. When I was younger, I applied to be a 911 operator for the city I was living in, Northern California. I got through most of their tests and interviews, which there were numerous. The pool of applicants was over 200 for about 8 positions. I got down to the last dozen applicants, then they played some recordings for us. The recording I listened to was a young girl calling 911 from inside a closet. She was crying and hysterical, saying that her dad was in the house with a gun and was going to kill her mom. You could hear the mother screaming in the background, and the operator was really calm and collected. She got the little girl to keep her voice down and whisper and tried to keep her on the line. You could hear the gunshots in the background. I couldn't listen to it anymore. I didn't want her to find out what happened next, so I don't know the outcome. I knew I couldn't handle that then. I don't think I could take something like that now. I was an alarm dispatcher for about a year. Scariest I had was during the night shift. I had a woman whose alarm went off while she and her daughter were asleep. She grabbed her daughter and ran into her room and locked the door. She had a gun. The woman said she did not know why it went off and requested we dispatch the police. Protocol for the company I was with was for us to stay on the line with them while a seat neighbor called the police for us. About 30 seconds after we began the call for the police, she said the door handle was being jiggled from the outside, and stopped after a few attempts. She kept saying she was going to go out there, and no matter how many times I told her to stay in the room. Last 30 seconds of the call she was not responding. I hung up with her and called the police back and asked what was going on. They advised that police were on scene. Worst part about the job was not knowing what happened after we hung up. Glad I'm not there anymore. Not me, but someone that shared their story one day. They received a call from a woman whispering down her phone stating that there were intruders in her house. She was hiding down the side of her bed. They were downstairs and she was upstairs in her bedroom. She kept quiet for 10 minutes, keeping the call handler updated through whispering. She then told the handler the men were coming up the stairs. Next thing the handler hears is the woman saying, "Please don't hurt me." The handler hears a noise that sounds like a scuffle and voices but can't quite hear what they are saying, then it suddenly goes completely silent. Except there's this noise that sounds like the wind blowing through an object, followed by a quiet gurgling noise. Turns out the wind noise was the sound of the poor woman trying to breathe through her lacerated windpipe, and the gurgling was the blood forming bubbles as the air pumped up from her lungs, pushing it out through the wound in her neck. The intruders had decided to slit her throat upon finding her and then continued to rob the house. Not a dispatcher, but this was a local news story. A few years back there was a guy that was wanting to scrap an oil drum, if I recall correctly. When he started cutting into it, it blew up and he caught on fire. He ran down to a nearby creek to put himself out. He passed a few days later in the hospital from the injuries. I vaguely remember hearing it come over our scanner that EMS had gotten there and some pieces of his skin were sliding off. It had to have been a horrible, horrible day for everyone involved. I was training to be an EMT, and was on a ride along. We show up to the scene and the only thing told to us was that it was a load and go, which meant rapid transport. I find the guy and he is making a wheezing noise trying to breathe. Turns out he had a brain bleed, and was having severe symptoms of high intracranial pressure. The ride to the nearest trauma center was only about 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 hours as we just tried to keep him from choking on his own vomit. With something like that, we couldn't really do much except hope we made it in time. It was definitely a wild experience for a ride along, and the craziest part was just cleaning up all the blood and vomit in the ambulance and quickly moving on to our next call. It's definitely not something I'll ever forget in my lifetime. My late wife was a 911 dispatcher for 15 years. The two worst stories I remember her telling me of were a call she didn't answer, but was on duty during and heard the playback of. A woman called that her ex-boyfriend was breaking into her house and he then beat her to death with a hammer, all of which was heard on the phone. When they were hearing it, they weren't sure what it was but found out when the officers arrived. The second was when she was doing EMS calls. A man had recently had surgery on his legs and was unable to get up out of bed or his recliner by himself. He calls because his wife is having a heart attack on the other side of the room and he can't do anything to help her. She said listening to him begging for help was the worst thing she ever had to sit through. Nearing the end of the rather uneventful night shift, I took a call from a young lady who frantically announced that she was going into labor. There was nobody there with her, her apartment door was locked, and it was apparent that delivery was imminent. Childbirth calls are quite rare. For emergency medical dispatchers, they are said to be once-in-a-career occurrences. We are nonetheless trained for this, so when the call does come, we are prepared to help the caller through delivery of the baby. What I wasn't prepared for, however, was helping a would-be mother deliver her own baby. Thankfully, by the time I finished obtaining all the geo-validation information and pertinent medical history, A few minutes into the call, I could hear someone knocking on her door. It was her sister, but she couldn't get in because the door was locked. The caller insisted she was not able to go unlock the door on account of her being in active labor. I managed to convince her to crawl to the door to let the person in, and she painstakingly did so while voicing her discomfort in the form of various moans, grunts, and profanities. She finally let the other person in and handed the phone to the visitor. Relieved because I now knew what to do, I started providing the preparatory instructions. Gather pillows, towels, blankets, removing clothing from the waist down, etc. But there was no time for prep. That baby was coming, and it was coming now. OMG, the head is out. I remember hearing, followed by her shrieking, "Oh no, oh no. The cord is wrapped around the neck." I instructed her to attempt to loosen the cord and slip it over the head, and she was able to. Within moments, baby was born. But baby was limp, blue, and not breathing. After what felt like minutes, but was likely only a few seconds, I decided to advise the caller that she would need to start doing chest compressions. Thankfully, before any of that started, I could hear the reassuring sound of a baby crying on the other end of the phone. With excitement in her voice, she announced that baby was moving, and the color was improving. It was a baby boy, and he was alive. The paramedics arrived and I congratulated the caller before disconnecting the call. By this time, it was past the end of the shift, and the day crew had logged on at all the desks except mine. Instead of going home, the night crew had gathered around my desk to watch me take this call. After disconnecting, I was met with cheers from my colleagues. During my next shift, I was informed that baby was healthy and I was presented with a congratulatory letter and a little blue stork pin. Thanks for watching Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more videos about 911 dispatchers. Share your own 911 call story in the comments below. And check out the 911 dispatchers playlist, linked in the video description. Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. She can do compressions only, because the girl's jaw is completely gone. 911 operators, what call will you simply never forget? Not me, but my sister is a dispatcher. One time she received a call from a man who said he just killed his sister and brother. She kept him on the phone for 5 or 6 minutes to make sure he didn't run before officers arrived. She got him to admit they had all been drinking and playing cards, then got into an argument when one of them accused the other of cheating. The other two went to bed, but this guy stayed up stewing. Apparently he couldn't let it go. He shot each of them in their beds while they slept, then called 911. I heard a partial recording of the call and she sounded calm AF. She told me she was screaming on the inside the entire time. Student paramedic here. Had a call being general broadcasted over radio when I was chilling in base with my mentor. We were on a 2-man car ambulance. Operator who was broadcasting said something along the lines of, "Female, reportedly unconscious, police on scene, major trauma, pause, CPR in progress, confirmed arrest by police on scene." My mentor looks at me. We're off in 30 minutes at the end of the night shift, but we go anyway. We're around the corner. Make it there in no time at all. There's police everywhere. At least 7 squad cars. I'm nervous as hell and so is my mentor. As we approach the house, a man emerges, handcuffed by police. He looks content enough and smiles at us as we walk by. Police shout for us to hurry. We run over with equipment to front door and are met with one of the worst scenes I've ever seen and will always be there in my mind. There's a woman lying on the ground, with the left side of her head caved in, blood absolutely all over the place and brain matter scattered around the floor too. Police are doing CPR, we stop them when we see the patient has signs of pooling and rigor mortis. I'm literally sweating and on the verge of tears. This is not how I wanted my shift to end. Then, we hear from behind us more police in the house and the sounds of children. 2 kids are escorted out of a bedroom behind us with their eyes covered and one of them asks, "What's going on? Where's mommy?" My heart melted. I've never been exactly traumatized by a job, but those kids being shielded from what just happened to their mother will stick with me forever. I bring equipment back to the ambulance as my mentor starts to do paperwork and we wait for someone to move the body. Social services arrive and take the kids, blissfully unaware of what's just happened. Was off 3 hours late after all the paperwork and interviewing from police. Good job, but man has it left its mark on me. Older lady, I want to say maybe early 70s, calls in with a sort of polite urgency in her voice, tells me she thinks she's having a stroke. Tells me she has her grandchild at the house with her, asks me to call her daughter to come get the child. By the time she's done giving me the phone number, there's just a very slight slur in her speech. By the time EMS got there, probably no more than 5 minutes or so, I couldn't understand a thing she was saying. Fascinating, disturbing, and profoundly sad hearing someone stroke out on the phone as they're talking to you. This actually happened a few days ago. I'm an ER tech, but one of our unit secretaries, someone who transfers calls and does other important tasks that keeps the place afloat, is an EMT in the next county over. I was waiting for a patient to return to their room, talking with her, when she looks down at her phone. She tells me she has the dispatch app or whatever for ambulances and fire trucks, and every fire hole in the county had just received a call about a possible decomposing body. Apparently the neighbor called about a terrible smell coming from the property. Hazmat was called and everything, expecting a dead human body. Once they broke into the house, they found that it wasn't a dead human, but 38 dogs in the house. 11 of the dogs were dead and in varying states of decomposition. The place is still pretty much under wraps, but 16 more dogs were found in the shed yesterday. The 2 people who own the house have since been arrested and charged with 51 counts of animal cruelty. All of the animals left alive were taken to the Humane Society, where half of the county has just about donated food or blankets. The whole thing is pretty messed up, but I now for sure respect the hell out of the EMTs and paramedics that walk through our doors every day. They really never know what they're going to see when they walk into a place. Not 911, but tele-nursing. People called me plenty when it should have been 911. Grandma calls me about her 16-year-old, 40-week pregnant, granddaughter. Hey, my grandbaby is pregnant and she just went to pee and said the cord is hanging out. Is that normal? Me, no. Not even a little bit. Gynecologist replies. What you describe sounds like umbilical cord prolapse, when just a loop of the umbilical cord falls out of the cervix, and that's one of the true gynecological super emergencies. Why? Because the umbilical cord is the only way a fetus can get oxygen, so if that gets pinched, like say, by loop slipping out of the very narrow cervix, no oxygen. Now think how long people can usually make it without oxygen. So, this is a serious situation. I only saw one during my time, but literally, my attending, after realizing what was happening, shoved her hand up there, to prevent any further prolapse or pinching, and the poor patient was rushed into the OR with her hand still up there for an emergency C-section. That's how critical this is. I've been a 911 dispatcher for 11 years in a medium-sized center, population 180,000. We have more than our share of crazy calls, but there are only a few calls that have stuck with me. For me, the ones that I can't get rid of aren't even close to being the craziest or most brutal. 8 years ago I took a 911 call from a man who came home to find his adult sister had been raped and beaten. The suspect had wrapped a telephone cord around her neck, then tried to push her through the window of the apartment. He was understandably very distraught. She was still alive and was able to talk to me. She had not been blindfolded and I was certain I could get a description of the person who had done this to her. She answered all of my other questions but absolutely refused to give me any info on the suspect. I later found out that the reason was self-preservation. The person who did it was the brother who called 911 for help. He was so believable it really messed with my head. I also felt horrible that I had continued pressing her for info with the person who hurt her was right there and that I could have potentially put her in more danger without realizing. I have a few. I took a call from a man whose 1-year-old daughter fell in the pool while unattended. At the time of the call she was not breathing, unresponsive, and had no pulse. My partner dispatched out fire and EMS while I was on the phone. Got the child's mother to start CPR. Fortunately she was certified and didn't require very much instruction at all, just had to tell her to count her compressions out loud so I could keep up. Before first responders arrived, the baby starts breathing again. I believe she sustained some brain injury but nothing life-threatening. Had to go take a walk around the block after that one. Please, if you aren't CPR certified, get certified. It very well may have been the difference between the child living and dying. On a lighter note, I also had a guy call in claiming he was having a heart attack. None of the info I got from this guy indicated he was even remotely at risk for one. Mid-20s male, average weight, no history of heart problems, or any other medical history for that matter. Turns out he had smoked some particularly strong pot about 30 minutes prior to culling. Absolutely nothing wrong with him other than he was stone stupid. We got a pretty good laugh out of that one. I also took a call from a kid who was about 10 years old who thought it would be funny to prank call 911. He started off by saying there was a fire. I could hear him giggling in the background. Followed that up with meowing at me over the phone. Managed to get a good location off the call and got his address. Read the address to him and asked if that's where he lives. Click. Alright, got you now, you little she. Had a deputy go out to the house as is our policy and he explained the situation to the parents. Deputy told me later the kid got the butt chewing of a lifetime. Super gratifying. A young man 23 years old called and told me he was going to commit suicide. He was my first call of my shift that day, very early in the morning. He planned to set his car on fire with himself inside. He was upset and crying but he apologized to me. He said he was sorry I picked up the phone and he was sorry for how this was going to affect me. He hung up on me and the second time I was speaking to him I could hear liquid splashing in the background. He ended hanging up again and I never got him back. He did end up setting the on fire and it was fully engulfed by the time anyone got there. I'll never forget his name or voice and I simply hope I showed him kindness and compassion in his last moments. This one still bothers me because it's so fresh and our community is hurting from it as well. Took a call from a hysterical woman advising me of a rollover crash that happened near her house. She lives near the top of a blind hill that people like to jump, like catching that butterfly feeling in your stomach, although you can get air in the right vehicle. She tells me that a girl is laying on the ground about 30 feet or so from the vehicle. When asked if the girl is alive, she says, "Oh yes, honey, she's wiggling around on the ground. My daughter is a nurse, she's checking on her now." Awesome. We hardly ever are lucky enough to have a trained professional on scene before a med unit can get there. But then she tells me her daughter is starting CPR. To be honest, that didn't surprise me. My caller was getting hysterical again and we already had first responders on the way, so I started asking more questions about the scene. Her daughter breaks CPR to get on the phone with me. Tells me she can do compressions only, that the girl's jaw is completely gone. A bit stunned, I tell her to continue compressions. But rather than getting put back on with the original caller, I hear the scared voice of a teenage girl, the driver. Is my friend going to be okay? I can't find anything to say for a moment. Finally, after what seemed to be too long, I say they're doing CPR, dear. And we have help on the way. Are you and the other passenger okay? We're fine. Just please tell me she's okay. The girl on the ground was confirmed DOA. She had been laying down in the back seat without her seatbelt on because she had a headache. She was 15. For me, the worst ones are always the calls you can relate to on a personal level. I took a call last month from a father who discovered his son with a bag over his head and a note next to his body. I've taken a ton of suicide calls, but this one was particularly difficult for me because the son was my age, and the way the father pleaded with his son was almost exactly the same way I've imagined my dad if I were to ever do the same. I've had the same "come on, buddy. Don't do this to me" running in my head at least 2 to 3 times a day since. Also, not technically a call but my first shift on my own, I dispatched the deputy I did my ride along with to a domestic that he ended up being shot and killed at. Hearing his blood-gurgled shots fired scream on the radio won't be something I'll ever forget. Well, my buddy is a fireman and dispatch had just alerted them of a man having chest pains. They get to the guy's house, and as soon as they open the door, the dude's dog runs outside. The dude shouts, "You let my dog out. Go get my dog. Please." So my buddy immediately starts chasing the dog. He catches the dog, comes back to the house, and when he walks in the door he sees that the man having chest pains had actually shot a hole in his chest while cleaning his gun. Old dude shoots himself in the chest, tells 911 it's chest pains, and when help arrives, he makes them go chase his dog down before tending to his own life-threatening wound. A woman complaining of spiders in her vagina. In college, I worked as an EMT in a major city. Not the craziest call I ever had, but one of the wackiest call-outs we ever got was to respond to a woman complaining of spiders in her vagina. I'll never forget pulling up to this major intersection where, sure enough, there's this old lady lying on the sidewalk with her pants off and legs spread up in the air. Turns out it was this transient lady in her 70s who had been having some wild hallucinations. We still had to check for spiders. On my second full-time shift, it was about 11 p.m. on a Thursday. We get a call from a female, screaming, just screaming. That's all we heard. We lost connection. Second 911 call from the neighbor across the street. I think I just heard a gunshot and now our neighbor is screaming, yelling for help. I think something terrible happened. While my partner was getting more info from caller number 2, 911 rings again and it's the original caller. She's still screaming but is trying to speak, even though I can't understand anything she's saying. After a couple very stern verbal slaps of "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and tell me what is going on," she's finally able to tell me that she thinks her husband just killed himself. She went on to explain that they were watching a TV show together, everything seemed normal, when he got up and said that he would be right back. Wife heard the back deck door open and close and then she heard a gunshot. She ran to the door and just saw his feet and legs lying down on the deck. She called initially but was unable to control herself and accidentally hung up. She was still a complete disaster when I talked to her, but I was able to get the basics of what happened and relay the info to responding officers and fire. She kept telling me that she needed to go outside and help him. Do I need to go out there? Do you need me to go out there? I don't want to see him, I can't see him. My only job at that point was to try and keep her calm and keep her from getting up from the corner of the kitchen floor where she had collapsed until police arrived and secured the weapon. They had been married 27 years, 2 kids, 3 grandkids. Lived a happy life together. She had no indication that anything was wrong. Her husband got up from the couch, walked out onto the back porch and blew his head off with a black powder pistol. I don't remember her name, but I will never be able to forget her screams. I have shared this before but one that sticks with me is a 14-year-old girl that calls the police for a disturbance. Officers show up and everything seems average. Parents advise the reporting party is upset because she isn't allowed to go out with her boyfriend. Officers are getting ready to leave after being there for 40 minutes but something seems off to them. The 2 officers take the 14-year-old outside and near their patrol units to speak to her. While they are walking outside, the girl's mother, stepfather and 2 sisters go and stand on the porch to see if they can see what is going on. They are unable to hear due to their officers and girl being on the other side of the street. It was then when the stepfather started pacing and went inside. The girl breaks down and tells the officers that her stepdad has been sexually assaulting her for years and he didn't want her to go see her boyfriend because he was jealous. The officers look up and at that moment they see the stepfather shoot the mother in the back of the head. He proceeds to shoot the reporting party's older sister in the chest and her younger sister in the leg as they started running away. One officer returns fire while the other is shielding the reporting party. The stepfather runs inside and barricades himself. The reporting party tells the officer that her 2 brothers are inside with the stepfather. Backup arrives and surround the home. The officers make forced entry after they hear gunfire from inside. They storm the residence and find the stepfather has shot himself in the head with his 2 biological sons in the same room. The mother died instantly, the older sister died instantly, the younger sister was hospitalized. I don't know if she made it, just know she was flown to a hospital miles away. This 14-year-old lost her family. Later the investigators were taking her statement and her only reply was, "Last time I tried to tell someone the truth I lost my family, doesn't matter what I say. I'm alone now." It took hours to get in contact with the family. Eventually we were able to get in touch with her grandparents and she left with them. I think about this kid a lot and hope she is okay. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell if you haven't yet. Please share your own 911 call stories in the comments below. Let us know what you have experienced. Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. In 30 minutes I can get some time alone in the ER toilet and take 5 minutes to cry. 911 operators, what is the most disturbing call you've ever received? I got an open line cell phone 911 with what pretty much sounded to me like a death rattle on the line. Like, these long drawn out gasping breaths with shuddering exhales. It was horrifying. Every so often, the guy would mutter a word or 2 in response to my questions about where he was, but not enough to actually figure out his location or what had happened. His phone was mapping near a road, so I assumed he'd been run over and I was literally listening to a man die. It went on for nearly 20 minutes while we frantically searched for him. Finally, we got an address associated to the cell number and went to check it. The home was sort of nearby the road from earlier, so now I'm thinking he's committing suicide at home while on the line with me. We found him in his own backyard, too dead drunk to communicate but very much alive, having twisted his ankle whilst trying to hop his fence. I stand by my assertion that the breathing was still the creepiest thing I've ever had to listen to, but at least it had a good ending. A woman calls, I answer, and she is crying hard. Still coherent though, knowing she needs to relay information to me as quickly as possible. She gives me the address and then I ask what the problem is there. It's my son. He has fallen in the bathroom and is laying against the door so I cannot open it more than a few inches. Is he able to talk to you? Her, breaking into great sobs and then sucking them back down to answer my question. No, he isn't saying anything. I can see in there, he has a needle in his arm. I think he overdosed. This has happened before but I can't get in. He is laying against the door. So for the next 5 minutes I listened to this mother crying and struggling not to while she answered a few of my follow-up questions. After that I encouraged her to talk to her son and let him know help was on the way, to give her something to do to feel useful, and also it was possible he could still hear, until EMS arrived. He was a 22-year-old drug addict, and my heart broke during this call listening to this mother's sorrow that came from so deep inside of her. I got drunk that night, and I still carry those 10 minutes of my life with me to this day. 1. There was a drive-by shooting and the bullet got into the house and struck a small boy in the head while he was sleeping next to his cousin. Uncle called 911 and I pleaded with him to go into the room and try CPR but he refused. Normally gunshot wounds to the head we wouldn't push for CPR but he was just a child and I felt I had to try. I understand now it was too disturbing for him to get close to the body, but I was just mad about the whole situation at the time. 2. Had a baby not breathing call. Parent described the infant saying blood was coming out of her nose and mouth. I imagined the worst while walking them through CPR. I learned later it was an innocent dad fell asleep on the couch holding baby and somehow rolled over in his sleep. Baby didn't make it. 3. Mom walked in on her husband molesting her child. The shock and horror in her voice while she was trying to keep calm for the kid got to me. 4. Man sat in his car outside his house and called to tell me to send the cops to find his body before his family did. Then I heard the gunshot. Then nothing. 5. Mom reporting her teenager missing. Routine enough call, gathering info calmly. She decides to check outside for some reason. Sees her kid hanging from the tree and just screams and screams until help got on scene. I'm a firefighter in Florida. I have 3 calls that really affected me. First was a 13-year-old brain aneurysm. She had a headache, started burning up and collapsed with 2 younger girls in the room. They called 911. We arrive and her right eye pupil is completely dilated, while the left is constricted. Mom bursts into the room screaming, "Save my baby." We transported as she started posturing. Sign of increasing intracranial pressure, they pronounced her dead 30 minutes later. I cried like a child as I cleaned up the ambulance. Imagine having a completely healthy and happy little girl and within an hour she's gone. The second call was a F350 versus a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The passengers in the F350 climbed out from the vehicle on its side. The man driving the bike hit a light pole tearing partially in half. The woman on the back of the motorcycle was thrown into a ditch with her left leg ripped off. She died immediately from blood loss. I remember she looked so much like my sister. I called her at 3 a.m. and told her I loved her. Third, parents left the oldest child of 4 in charge while they went grocery shopping. The oldest sister, who was 13 years old, was making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches while the youngest brother snuck outside and drowned in the family pool. We worked that little boy for so long and the parents never showed up. I remember her screaming "I'm sorry" as I drove the ambulance away. I can't imagine what that little girl feels. What the parents feel. I have nightmares about it. A young woman calls. She is very calm, and it's quiet on a Sunday morning when she tells me she killed her baby by bashing their head on the floor because she believed the devil was inside the baby. Another one, a man was in his large SUV and backing out of his driveway and he noticed a group of small girls walking by. He backs up once he thinks they've passed, except there was one left and he ended up running over her. He was the one who ended up calling 911 himself, on a landline, thankfully, while the neighbors did CPR, and he was hysterical. The little girl ended up dying. He attempted suicide later that night. My dad was a cop, and one late night, he had to investigate a call from this lady who said there was a prowler outside her house. He and his partner go around the house with their flashlights and don't find anybody. They knocked on this lady's door to let her know, and she yells for them to come in. So they go inside, and there is the lady, butt naked on the kitchen floor, smothering herself in peanut butter and spaghetti and tomato sauce. She asked them if they brought their appetite. There was never a prowler, she was looking for love. In all the wrong places. She was taken in for a psychiatric evaluation. This wasn't the first time she had called in a false report, apparently she had a thing to dudes in uniform. It was, however, the first time she had done something so extreme upon their arrival. Me, 911. What's the address of your emergency? Caller, I have a rope and I'm going to hang myself. Me, why do you want to harm yourself? What is your address so I can get you some help? Caller, it's 123 Go to Hell Street. I then hear a crashing noise and then gagging. I listen to him choke and gag for 8 minutes before the call dropped. I spent that time refitting the GPS ping trying to get a location, but it was outside our county, so I didn't have address points. I narrowed it down to 3 houses on a street just across the county line. I called them to pass along the info and they found one of the addresses I narrowed down had a male with a history of suicide attempts. They found him with the rope around his neck and transported him to a local psych hospital. Everyone who has been on any length of time has lots of horror stories. I'll share my 2 worst ones. They both involve kids. Seems like the worst ones always do. The first one that comes to mind was getting ready to go off shift, and 5 minutes before the end, the phone rings and I spend the next several minutes listening to a woman who was outside her apartment while her kids are upstairs burning to death in a fire. The sounds she made were like she was being murdered herself. Turns out she had been complaining to the landlord for months about the furnace having problems, and he kept putting her off. I had a young kid at the time and that messed me up since I kept imagining it being my child in the crib. The second was listening to first responders deal with a fatal crash that occurred on Thanksgiving evening. There were 2 young adults ejected out of a subcompact car after they hydroplaned and were hit on the passenger side by a Dodge Dakota. They were ejected and flew into the woods about 50 feet from the car. The family showed up and asked about the baby. The troops and EMTs ran to the car, which was bent in on itself, and the bumper post from the Dodge had burst through the rear passenger side door and hit the infant in the head. They had to call the counseling team in for that one. I was a state emergency service volunteer search and rescue dude here in Australia for many years. Did many rescues, body recoveries and so on. One call out for a rescue, well 2 technically, that has stuck with me for over a decade now was when we did the body recovery of a young male suicide victim that had hung himself in a tree. We carried his body out of the bush and his mom and dad and his family were with police there, and they all thanked us and were extremely grateful for us doing it. A year to the day later, we recovered his dad's body from the same tree. He died with pictures of him and his son from baby to adult and some pills and booze around him. His dad just never got over the death of his son and took his own life as well. Again, we had the same family members thank us for doing it. It was very heartbreaking. I still bring this up quite regularly in toolbox meetings and chats with guys that may be struggling, as I work in an industry that has a very high suicide rate, and if I can stop at least one other family from going through this, then it's worth it. One of my best friends was a 911 operator. She took a call that was a mom who found her 14-year-old son who'd hung himself. She was really messed up by that call. She didn't go back after that day, needed therapy for a while. She is one of the main reasons I think every 911 operator should be eligible for the same kind of PTSD treatment and time off and accommodation that on-scene first responders get. For those of you who are 911 operators, firefighters, police people, EMTs, paramedics, and tow truck drivers, I appreciate the hell out of your ability to deal with situations like that, because that kind of stuff would just break me instantly. A while back I responded to a toddler beaten brutally by his mom's boyfriend. And I mean, this was brutal. I won't give you the details, but suffice to say, I'm all but certain he was trying to kill this kid. We couldn't even use a BP cuff on him because his arms were so damaged. We got him stabilized and strapped in as gently as we could and rushed him to the nearest children's hospital. He held onto my fingers and played with my hand most of the ride, and I even got him to smile when I presented him with the stuffed animal we keep on board for kiddos. But there were a lot of unsavory details about that ride that made me think, okay, in 30 minutes I can get some time alone in the ER toilet and take 5 minutes to cry. Then, because the mom's boyfriend had been arrested, I had to document everything within an inch of its life. That means every bruise, every laceration, every puncture, or contusion in vivid detail so that they'd have proper documentation in court. And after that call I took about 10 minutes to decompress and then it was on to the next call. I can't even remember what it was. I think a 60-year-old woman who called 911 because she fell asleep while eating in front of the TV and thought it meant she was dying. Spoiler, she was not dying. Just tired. I did go to therapy the next day to process that stuff, but not because I was asked to by my job. I just know that's what I have to do to stay sane. But we don't get automatic time off because things are sad. Sometimes with a death we are given time or someone to talk to. But in a lot of cases, there are tragedies that hit just as hard, if not harder, than a death. But more often than not we are 100% expected to finish our calls and move on to the next one without missing a beat. Got two. One was when I was only a few weeks into training. I'm on a Y cord with my trainer, both listening to the same calls, only her talking. 911 call, trainer picks up, and the man answers very calm, provides his name and address, and states he's in the shed out back. Then, his voice cracks, and he says I'm going to kill myself. I just thought that someone should know. Click. We sent everyone we had, but by the time they got there, he had shot himself. His whole family was in the house, but they didn't even realize he was gone till half a dozen cruisers pulled up. I'm just very thankful he hung up though before doing it. The worst call stories are the ones where they hear the shot. I don't think I would have stayed here if I had. Second one. I'm out of training at this point, but only recently released. Get a 911 call from a woman who is absolutely hysterical. It takes her a few moments to give me her address. Side note, always give the address first. Even if the call disconnects, we'll know where to send people to search. Then I ask what's going on. Her 11-year-old son had taken her entire bottle of blood pressure medication. She had no idea that anything was even wrong with him before. She just kept saying, "But he's my good boy and stay with me, baby." Suicide calls suck. I was crisis and suicide hotline volunteer. One afternoon I get a call, woman is crying. She and her husband got into a domestic situation and she needs to chat to calm down. I check to make sure she's safe. She is. Her husband hopped in his truck and sped off. She's alone and locked in the bathroom. Just needs a friendly ear. We were talking for about 10 minutes when there's pounding on the door, and the woman starts screaming. He'd gone somewhere and picked up an axe, screaming he was going to kill her as he attempted to get through the door. The woman gave us her address and we sent the police. She was terrified but okay when the police arrived. He had taken off when he realized police were en route. I spoke to the officer and got to say goodbye to the caller. Mom set her 3 kids on fire. Another, dad was walking with his 10-year-old son, picks up son and then jumps over a bridge. Another one, 12-year-old drops during hockey game, assisted throughout the whole call, couldn't get him back. Worked him for another 45 minutes at the hospital, nothing. Worst part, we ran VSA, vital signs absent, in the middle of the arena to his screaming parents at the side, the entire time. Another, pregnant lady, 20-ish weeks gestation, diagnosed with brain cancer. Given 2 options, treat herself and lose the baby with still high probability of death, or refuse treatment with certain death and carry out pregnancy. She chose to attempt pregnancy and refuse treatment. A few weeks later she had a miscarriage. I have hard time remembering calls, but it's easier to bring up here when these threads arise. Be nice to a paramedic when you need one. You never the kind of day we've had. I worked in a non-urgent police line. Think police are required, but it's not really a lights and sirens problem. Enter with intent with no offender on premises, vehicles entered into it, and I'll never forget this one. She was absolutely frantic. She had found her son in the shed, hanging from the rafters. It was unknown as to how long he'd been there, but she had the phone in one hand and she's trying to hold him up with the other, wailing in the process. And I'm talking screaming. If I recall correctly, he was dead and had been for some time. I've also had a woman call on a Sunday afternoon where it's pretty low-key, just mostly downtime, saying she killed her mother. She described to me in great detail how she had beaten her, stabbed her, and she was sitting in the kitchen with her body as we spoke. Turns out she was severely mentally ill and none of this had actually occurred, but for those 15 minutes, she fooled me completely. I've also had someone describe to me a very specific bomb threat which they swore black and blue they weren't a part of, but told me the size, location, composition and when the bombs were due to explode, approximately 40 minutes from when the call started. Again, mentally ill, but we tracked him down and he was charged, and I had to submit an affidavit to court for prosecution. But the one that hurt me most was listening to a woman call for help, saying her husband was abusive and during the call he came home and beat her mercilessly while the phone line was active. I heard everything. That was tough to listen to, considering I was dating a domestic violence victim at the time. I no longer work for the police. My friend's mom is a 911 dispatcher and she has a lot of great stories, but this one topped them all. She was at work on a Friday night when she got a call from a young, panicked man who told her he was bleeding rapidly from his butt. My friend's mom asked if he could locate the bleeding, to which he replied, "My anus." She told him that it really sounds like a hemorrhoid that's broken or whatever you call it, and that he should go to the ER as soon as possible to get it stitched up, because the bleeding was too heavy to stop by itself. The guy was furious and said, "Who do you think I am? It's Friday night, do you really want to make me spend the night in an ER? I'm going clubbing tonight." Friend's mom said, "I'm sorry, but there will be no clubs for you tonight, sir. You better stay home and wait for the wound to heal." Then he said, with those direct words, "But the ladies are waiting for me. I don't care about a hemorrhoid." She ended up convincing him to go to the ER. Worst call I ever had, with a rather anticlimactic ending, was a call from a 7-year-old girl about her dad who was having a diabetic hypo. Her mom was at work, it was just those two in the house, and he was aggressive, agitated and confused, normal for a hypo. She was crying down the phone, and was hiding as she was scared of him. Then, all of a sudden, she shrieks into my ear, the loudest, blood-curdling scream you can imagine. I try and ask what's happening and the line goes dead as she's screaming, like the sort of thing you'd expect to happen in a horror film. After what felt like forever waiting for the BT operator to come back onto the line and confirm it had disconnected, I called back and the little girl's mom answered the phone. She was home from work. I don't know why the line disconnected, but apparently he came into the room where she was hiding when she shrieked. Obviously those few minutes in between felt like an eternity, and my mind was thinking the worst. Another story, but more distressing emotionally for me, was an elderly lady who had called in the middle of the night to say that her husband had stopped breathing. As I'm talking her through CPR, she starts apologizing, saying she thinks she has had a bad dream as she was doing CPR on her pillow and her husband had died years before. I don't want to talk about the bad ones, those'll never go away. Instead I give you two of my favorites. We used to have these old data heads that would send us an address and a small description of a call. We got called to a company after hours for a 20-year-old male exposed to stripper. I was laughing my butt off on the way. Sadly it turned out to be paint stripper and our dispatcher didn't understand that we don't get all the info. Next was a dude who got in a fight with a monkey. I didn't end up attending, as another car was closer, but in the notes it comes up man got in fight with monkey. Was bitten, but states he got a few good shots in too. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more shocking real-life stories. Thanks to all emergency dispatchers and call handlers. You are heroes. Share your own 911 stories in the comments below. Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. His genital had sort of melted to the kitchen floor. People who cleaned up dead bodies, what is your most disturbing story? Search and rescue personnel here. Working in Las Vegas we see a ton of really messed up stuff. Chances are pretty high that if we're looking for a missing person we'll find an unrelated subject. Worst one was when we were deployed to find a female stuffed in a suitcase. After recovering the female in the suitcase, the coroner said it was the wrong female in a suitcase and we were sent back out to find the right one. I guess I should clarify, though we aren't a cleanup crew, we are often tasked with body recovery. The coroner's office does the packaging and Ellie does the investigation, we then solemnly carry them out. Everyone needs to come home eventually, there's someone out there who cares for them. I'm not a scene cleaner, but I did have to clean up my father's brains and blood from the room he killed himself in. The people basically just didn't do a thorough job. There were red streaks down the hallway walls from the blood-soaked bed being taken out. And it's like they didn't have a ladder because the walls of the room were clean until nearly the roof, then you could see splatters. I found a piece of rotten brain stuck to the top of the curtain rails. There was also a smell we believe was from the blood soaking into the wooden floors, so we had to have those floors replaced. Police detective here. In a rural area a guy had passed away in his yard. In July. It was 8 days before someone found him. He was partially liquefied, there were flies everywhere and the stench was quite nasty. The knowing where these flies were before they landed on your face did not help. Had to shovel him in the bag with gas masks. Just to let you know, liquid people are quite toxic. It depends on the conditions people die. Had a guy hang himself in the woods near a village in the winter. He was pretty skinny and old, maybe decided to end it himself. After 4 days out in the cold wind, he was basically a human jerky. If there is a lot of underskin fat and humidity, drowning in a well, the fat becomes soap-like. If a blanket falls over the wood stove, you will die from carbon monoxide poisoning, as most blankets are synthetic material. It will keep smoking throughout the night, while the temperature in the room keeps rising, basically slow cooking you. I get a lot of stories like that. I'm not a professional cleaner, but I have cleaned a murder scene before, unfortunately. My best friend was beat to death with a baseball bat in his home. It's apparently pretty expensive to have these people come out and clean, and his parents didn't have it. Trying to do what we could to help out, a few of his friends got together to clean it. I don't have anything crazier to say that I haven't already about the scene. The entire experience was extremely surreal and not something I think about often. I'd say the craziest thing would have to be the weird places. We'd find a speck of blood with seemingly no logical way for it to have gotten there. Logic, of course, had left that room before we got there. Does doing one on accident count? I used to do auto detailing in college for a car dealership. I was scrubbing the floor of a car, and no matter what I did, the water kept having a red tint to it. So I pulled the seats and found about an inch of dried crusted blood and what I can only guess was brain matter and skull fragments. Turns out it was a suicide car that the dealership bought at auction. It had been detailed before being sold, but they never pulled the seats. We called the cops to confirm it was all logged and shipped the car back to auction. The dealership lost their poop on it but wanted it as far away from their lot as possible. A friend of mine is a cop. He just told me of a guy they found dead in his kitchen. The stove and heater were on and he was naked. They assumed he was just cooking while naked. You know, how we all do from time to time. He was dead for at least 3 days. When they lifted him up to turn him around, his penis had sort of melted to the kitchen floor. As they pulled him upwards, the dangling participle stretched off the floor like a rubber band and released, slingshotting back to the body. It sounded absolutely disgusting as he described it. Funny paramedic story time. So a woman calls 999, says she thinks her father is dead. Call handler advises CPR but caller states it is too late. Crew arrives and paramedic approaches remote house, speaks to daughter, who is upset but advises she thinks it's too late. Paramedic enters property and finds what is effectively a skeleton in the kitchen laid on the floor. History is, daughter is fairly estranged and lives overseas from her father, normally sent Christmas cards and no other communication really. After 2 years of no cards, and him not answering the phone, she flies home and finds him dead in his home. I was a tow truck driver and the worst are motorcycle accidents usually. I've seen some really messed up car accidents, but I've seen motorcycle accidents where the driver was spread out several dozen yards across pavement. I've posted this before but I feel it's relevant here. I'm a police officer and have been on a good number of death scenes. One that sticks out in particular was a suspicious death on the top floor maintenance stairwell of a 5-story apartment building. I arrived and could smell the body from the bottom floor and the lobby. How it took this long for anyone to call in a building filled with 100 people is beyond me. I got in the elevator and began to go up, the smell getting worse with each floor. My corporal was with me and he started to look a bit sick. The door to the 5th floor opened and I was hit with a smell I will never forget. The poor man was laying face down on the top floor landing, just inside the doorway to the stairwell. He had been there for about 2 weeks in the middle of July in the southeastern United States. The top floor was not air conditioned as it was storage and maintenance, so it was around 100 degrees inside. The man was bloated, leaking his juices everywhere, and his skin was a necrotic black color. The juices were leaking down the stairs, dripping onto the landings of the 4th and 3rd floor. Now, this was classified as a suspicious death, so a detective had to come out to see if we could rule out homicide, just to be sure. As my corporal was currently heaving out an open window, I had the privilege of assisting the detective with rolling this bloated corpse over to inspect it for wounds. I took hold of his arm and rolled, and I felt the arm begin to separate from the body as more death juices spilled from his torso. Luckily, no obvious wounds. When body removal came, even they were gagging. Again, I got to assist with moving the corpse onto the gurney. We put on full-body Tyvek suits and masks to move him in case he burst. Luckily, he just leaked but did not split down the middle. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. Turns out he had a heart attack while on the landing and nobody seemed to realize he was gone. Once he was identified, I realized I met him the week before when he called in about a woman who overdosed on heroin that he came across while mowing yards for work. Woman was given Narcan and survived. Small world. I also recently had a man who committed suicide by drinking polyurethane. In case you're wondering, no, drinking polyurethane is not a painless and easy way to exit this world. Police officer here. Attended a scene where a guy went to his ex's house, walked in, and murdered her as well as her mother and teenage son. It was clear from the scene that he had gone in with a rifle and shot the three, but that the son had attempted to crawl to a phone in the kitchen. He then went out to his car and grabbed his shotgun and pumped a slug through each of their heads before putting one inside his own head. The son was in high school and was well on his way to college football. His girlfriend was scheduled to also be at the house but had last-minute issues with a family illness. In Florida, bodies decompose real quick. We're talking a good stench within 48 to 72 hours. What no one's mentioned, I don't think, is that when you walk away from that smell, it doesn't matter because it's all you can smell for days. The smell gives me anxiety, so I end up wearing so much perfume just so I can try to smell anything else, and I always end up apologizing to my coworkers or RSTs for the remainder of the shift. I worked in CSI in Mexico. Once we went to a safe house where the police found 14 people who were tortured and executed. You could smell the iron from the entrance. Upon entering, there were two women with broomsticks taped to the anus and the genitals. In the upstairs bathroom they found a woman tied to the toilet, died of dehydration, had urinated and defecated on her for days. It was evident that they also beat her before turning her into a toilet. One of the rooms had 5 shackles on the wall and in the center a metal bucket with water. The 5 people died of hunger and from beatings. The sickest was in the backyard. In a warehouse without windows there were several bodies that had their faces and hands removed. It was like watching a horror movie, but that's the narco in these places. Not a cleanup crew but attend the scenes. An old gentleman had died in the bath. The top half of his body was all swollen and puffy, whereas his legs and lower torso almost melted away. Essentially created a horrendous soup and casserole mix in the bath. The coroners had to sift through the bath to find his liver, which had come out. During the autopsy his testicles were so swollen they had to prick them just to drain out all the liquid. I just hate the smell. It seems to stick on your clothes. You come back into the office and everyone can smell it on you. My aunt died a few months ago in mid to late October. She wasn't found until Veterans Day on November 11th. She was using the bathroom when he believed she likely had a heart attack from masturbation. To which she tried running to the back door to get help. Along the way, relieving herself on the floor, she fell short about 15 feet from the door and dragged herself another 10. She lied there for 18 days before a neighbor called for a wellness check. My dad, who is a cop, and I got up there before they finished cleaning up everything. At this point she had decomposed just enough to become a part of the carpet. However, the scaring part was not the body in late-stage decomposition, not my dad's or my first time, but the remnants of her face which we could not scrub from the carpet. I didn't do a lot of crime scenes, unless you consider suicide a crime. We called it trauma cleanup. My first day I was supposed to clean fake vomit out of a cop car, but we got a suicide call. It was a Motel 6 and a 20-year-old guy checked into a room and shot himself in the heart. Somehow his dad knew where he was and got a key to his room. Dad opened the door, smelled gunpowder and called the police because he knew what happened. Another suicide I did was unusual because 1, it was a woman, the vast majority of the suicide calls were men, and 2, she used a gun. I was told this was extremely rare since women tend to take pills or slit their wrists. Some of my coworkers who had been in the business 10 years or more mentioned they'd never done a female suicide with a firearm before. She had a nice townhouse in a nice area but was divorced and lived alone since her kids had grown up. Her home was very clean except for the blood. For some reason her ex-husband was visiting and they were talking in the living room, and at some point she pulled out a pistol and shot herself in the heart. It was odd cleaning up all the blood among her knickknacks, and she had several signs with corny affirmations like "love grows in this garden" or "live, laugh, love." I cleaned what was once a beautiful 3-story home that belonged to a successful surgeon. This drive had devoted her life to her work, and after an injury she had to retire early. She didn't have any family and she got depressed and started collecting cats. By the time we were called, the cats completely took over the house and she lived in a tiny room in the basement. The ASPCA said they took about 60 living cats. We found dozens of dead and some mummified cats, as well as several litters of kitten skeletons. It was like a waking nightmare. The smell of ammonia was so intense the air felt thick. Every surface in the house was completely covered in several inches of mated cat hair and poop. The walls had so much fly shit on them it looked like they had tar smeared on them. The bathtubs had at least 3 inches of poop. All the metal in the house, like cabinet hinges or cans of food, were completely oxidized or rusted from all the ammonia. I worked at a house that was in a very affluent area and was a family with young kids. The dad was cleaning out the tool shed and within a few days starting feeling ill. They had a trip planned, but dad insisted the wife and kids do without him and he'd catch a later flight. By the time they landed, he was in the hospital. The family caught the next flight home, and when they got back he was dead. It took about a week for the CDC to figure out if it was the hantavirus, presumably from mouse poop in the tool shed. The family had to abandon their big beautiful home and everything in it except for the clothes on their backs. It was all potentially contaminated. The eerie part was how clean everything was except the rotting bowl of fruit, the dried out house plants and all the books on morning like, When God Doesn't Fix It. But the thing that really got me was an illustrated kid's book called Someone I Know Died. Maybe because the dad was about my age and the son was a little older than my son. The job that was the last straw for me was crawling through foot-deep sewage in the crawl space under the local housing projects. I'm not a crew member, but I got a story. A few years back I couldn't get a hold of my brother, so my stepmom and I drove out to make sure he was okay. He lived 2 hours from me and we haven't heard from him in 2 weeks. That was not uncommon for him. He did do a lot of drugs and was a very solitaire guy. I crawled in a window and I didn't smell anything nasty, just smelled like a musty old house. Anyways, got the door open and we found him in his room. He was definitely a few weeks into decaying. He was very bloated, and there was blood all over the room. I didn't initially see maggots, but from the report there was a ton in him that they mistook the bullet in his head for maggots on the x-ray. We had to go back the next day to his house and I found his tooth in the closet door rails on the floor. Also, the house smelled horrible oddly after the body was removed. His hair was stuck to the carpet, and a few maggots were on the floor. To deter anyone from suicide, he shot himself in the head and lived long enough to put the gun under his mattress. He lay down waiting for death, getting blood all over his mattress. The bullet was a .22, I believe. He realized that it was a mistake and got up to grab his phone and he fell over to the spot where I found him. Drugs are terrible. I had read from a previous post that a medical team witnessed a person wrapped in cloth with an electrode in his butt and the other electrode connected to a battery. The person was charred inside and his butt had melted and there was poop oozing out. I feel nauseous while typing this. The person was having some kind of kink play, but I guess the partner wanted him dead. Someone replied, not exactly cleaning up a crime scene, but I was a hospital corpsman in the Navy. It was my night to work the night watch. A guy came in somehow on his own. He was in massive pain, pointing to his genitals. We got him on a gurney and took off his pants, no underwear. It is hard to explain what we saw. His ballsack was swollen and mangled. Pus and dark purple with staples holding it together. Not surgical staples. Turns out he worked in the wood shop. He was a CB. One night all alone he decided to lay his nutsack on the belt of a wood lathe. He said he had done it before and got off doing so. Well, I guess a few nights earlier before he came in to get help his nuts got caught in the belt. He was able to switch it off but was cut pretty badly. Too embarrassed to call for help, this guy somehow had enough balls left to take out the staple gun and do first aid on himself. I can't imagine how much blood there must have been. A couple days go by and he is infected to all hell and swollen as a cantaloupe. He had no choice but to come get help. We had no idea what to do for him but rush him to the nearest civilian ER. I have no idea whatever became of him. My mom used to do cleanup for a certain teal and yellow cleaning company and was the only one certified to do hazmat. They did cleaning for the county sheriff's department, and the one that stuck with her was in the back of a cruiser. They had a meth head, as they described him. He was so tweaked out of his mind he kept rubbing his face back and forth across the dividing glass and managed to wear his face off from ear to ear. I got to see the pictures of it before cleanup, nearly 10 years ago, and it still haunts me to this day. Up until recently I used to run a small crime scene cleaning business which I operated for a couple of years. We had a number of weird, sick and disturbing jobs, but one that sticks out in my mind was a scene at a local hotel a few years ago. I received the call-out request early Sunday morning from the night duty manager requesting our services. We had experienced monsoonal rain the night before. This part is important. So I packed my ute and made my way to the location. When I arrived I was met with the duty manager and a few of his shell-shocked staff who kindly led me to the second floor of the hotel, which was currently under construction. They led me to an outside dining area that overlooked the pool on the ground floor, and I was immediately hit with the smell of fresh blood. Decomps have a certain smell which you get used to, but fresh blood just makes you feel often unsafe in such a primal way, I can't describe it. There before me in what used to be an outdoor garden was now a pool from the monsoonal rain combined with the blood of a poor soul who had fallen from the roof and hit the slated grate above the outdoor garden. My job was to utilize the existing drainage to clear some 2,000 liters of blood water, clean the slated outcropping over the outdoor garden on the 3rd floor, and then finally remove all the fingerprint dust that the local police had liberally dusted throughout his entire hotel room. All the while trying to be discreet about the work I was carrying out, as this was a 4-star hotel and holidaymakers below were happily going about their day, oblivious to what had taken place the night previous. After finishing up, I took the opportunity to talk with the now off-duty duty manager, and he explained what had happened. He said that the poor bloke who ended up poolside had been on a bit of a bender with a mate. CCTV showed him and his mate running around the hotel in the wee hours of the night wearing nothing but boxer briefs and looking visibly intoxicated and unruly. The statement his mate made to the police also mentioned that they had taken LSD and somehow he had ended up going over the balcony in his hotel room as they were mucking around trying to take pictures, doing questionable stuff and egging each other on. It was a real shame, as he was only a young bloke in his early 20s, and what was meant to be a fun night out ended in tragedy. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more disturbing videos. Click the right box for the Morticians and Funeral Workers playlist. Share your own death cleanup start in the comments below.
Most name brand bars and body washes you rub on your skin are classified by the FDA as synthetic detergent. It's not even...
Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. The cats were eating the top of her face, the nose and upper lip was gone. Death cleanup crews, what's the saddest and most disturbing case you've ever had to clean up after? I responded to a single vehicle involved with a moose. The caller was the driver and she had her young, 6-ish, son in the back. They were both okay but afraid and trapped in the car as the moose was lodged into the windshield. We arrived, and when we did, the moose woke up and kicked the mother to death trying to get itself dislodged. The boy had to watch the whole thing. We were removing him from the back seat and he said, "My mommy's dead, isn't she?" I'm a volunteer, so I'm not used to dealing with things like that. It was heartbreaking. Was working as a volunteer firefighter in 2011 in a small town in NY. A drunk driver in a truck hit a high school senior who was heading home on his motorcycle. The kid was still alive when we got there, saying how he didn't want to die. I put a tourniquet on his leg to stop the bleeding from his femoral. Leg was pretty mangled. I was talking to him and trying to keep him calm as we put him on the spine board. Then he got really quiet and said thank you for not letting me die alone, then he died. Messed me up pretty bad for a while how he just wasn't there anymore. My dad was a fireman. He said he always lucked out and seemed to miss the horrible stuff. But he knew these two firemen who every year took the same day off in July. That day they took off was in remembrance of a messed up case they were both at, where a house was on fire, going up quick and killing a few of the kids inside before anything could be done to save them. After the fire went out, the two firemen went in to get the bodies. They found two of the kids dead, cuddled in a closet, but they couldn't find the baby. They kept walking around looking for him when one of them realized they were standing on him, poor little thing, unrecognizable. My father worked many years as a CSI. More than once a biker versus truck crash required a shovel to scrape the biker remains from the asphalt. Once he found just a mustache, still attached to the upper lip, some 20 to 30 meters away from the crash. Not pretty at all. I work for a railroad, and after a collision usually we bring in a service to clean up the mess. However, during the repairs it's not uncommon to find bits of folk. Usually it's like a knuckle or something small, but the company leaves a bucket that we put it in and they will dispose of it later. One of my welders found a wedding ring that went in a special envelope and was given to the family promptly. Another time they found a shoe under a car that was several cars back. Either way, stay away from the tracks. The trains cannot turn out of the way. I just remembered one, but it wasn't me. It was a colleague of mine. Full summer heat. Body was left for days in his apartment, smelled all the way to the street from the 4th floor. When they moved him, the skin from his face slipped and fell, and my colleague slipped on it, like on a banana peel. He had to take the rest of the day off. One of my friend's dad is a retired correctional officer. One he told me sticks out. He was doing rounds on the catwalk of a big block of cells. Everyone is out on the yard because it was a nice day outside. He goes through some checkpoint to the next block of cells and smells blood. He gets around a corner and sees a guy sitting up in his bunk covered up to his neck with a blanket. Looks pretty normal. But looking down, the whole floor of the cell is completely covered in blood. The bunk is completely soaked with blood, the blanket is soaked in blood. The inmate had made a dam of towels against the bars of his cell to keep the blood from dripping out. He was completely white, he had slit both his wrists and then slit his own throat ear to ear. Almost all of his blood was on the cell floor. Literally, half an inch of coagulated blood over a 5x7 cell floor. You could see the blood losing oxygen, going from bright red to dull purple, as it got farther away from the body. He was alone for about 15 minutes tops between everyone getting let out for yard time and the next patrol on the catwalk. The inmate had a double life sentence and had just decided to end it. Husband shot wife in the head while sleeping and then himself. Usually I just sort of zone out while doing them and not thinking about it too much, but cleaning the blood splatter off one of their photo frames of them and the kids with the caption "World's Greatest Dad" was pretty sad. Also did a cleanup at a homeless shelter where the woman living there had drank herself to death. Someone at the front desk said their throat eroded from all the alcohol and they threw up blood everywhere. Midway through the cleaning, their sister showed up distraught and started stomping through all the blood pools on the floor, digging through everything looking for a note or anything sentimental left behind. Only found empty bottles and clothing though. Also very sad. I've been doing this kind of work for about 6 months, and a month or two ago we did a job where a 12-year-old girl shot herself in the head with a .357 while in her parents' bathroom. You can imagine the damage a large caliber bullet would do to a child at point-blank range. There were multiple skull fragments and mats of hair, of which, as a relatively new worker in this field, I had not become accustomed to this. No note, entire family was home at the time. We got there the next day to clean up and we worked 14 hours straight with the mother one room away crying like a banshee. Just the thought that what we were cleaning up was the remnants of such a young child, it really sticks with you. My father-in-law was a retired battalion chief in the New York Fire Department when 9/11 happened. He arrived after and was attempting to find people in the rubble. Unfortunately, he spent most of the time collecting shoes and the like so they could be identified. He said sometimes the feet were still in the shoes. My grandfather was an undertaker for a few years. He told me 2 different stories about picking up bodies. One was a really fat man that didn't have any family, and by the time he was discovered, his fat and skin had begun to essentially squeeze between the cushions in the couch he died on. While attempting to scoop him out of the couch, his skin came apart and dumped the rotten fatty contents onto the floor. Another one was a man that had shot himself through the mouth with a shotgun, but when they went to pick him up, he only had a bloody nose. The shot hit the inside of his skull just right and then spun around inside of his skull. Wasn't the cleanup crew for either of these, but my neighbor always sat outside with his little dog. He was a cool dude, my dad and him were friends, and he wasn't super close to his family from what I understood. We don't see him outside for a couple days, don't think much of it. Mention one day to my dad that it kinda smells outside, and there might be roadkill somewhere. It's pretty common out here, we live surrounded by woods. We checked on him the next day. Dead in the hallway. We think it was a heart attack. First time I ever saw my dad drink. We kept his dog for a while until someone in the guy's family asked if they could take it. The other one, my grandfather works for a funeral home, and he does the hair and makeup on the bodies for open casket things, and he had to do the makeup for a little girl that died in a house fire. Don't remember how it started, but I remember seeing it on the news. My grandpa is already a pretty quiet guy, but I think that messed him up really bad for a while. I'm not a professional by any means. But when you work at a large apartment complex, you see a lot of people. Because police officers and actual professionals do not have keys to individual apartments, I will typically accompany them into the apartment for wellness checks. So far in my 3 years at this property we have found 3 deceased. The first was a suicide of a middle-aged man that just decided to end it all. He bought a gun a few days before, gun case and receipt sitting next to him, he sat on the ground and ended it all. Going back to the office where his mother was waiting and seeing her fall to the ground in tears will never leave my mind. The other 2 were older folk who died of natural causes. But both of them sat for 2 to 4 days before being found. A lot of people don't realize how quickly we start to decompose after our heart stops pumping. Your fingers, toes, ears, and nose will start to rot and fall off. I have a lot of respect for the people that deal with these things on a day-to-day basis. The few experiences I had put me in a pretty huge funk for quite a while. Not me, but my best friend. She is the seventh generation of her family's owned and operated funeral home, and for a while she was doing renewals. By the way, what a crazy job. Your shift is just to be on call during a period of time, waiting to go get a dead body. She did it for several years before deciding it was too backbreaking, the schedule sucked, and the whole dead body thing. She told me the worst one she did, that it was the only one that the smell made her puke. The majority of her pickups were old people out in the country who were her sort of little family. This one in particular, as she stepped out of her car she could smell it, and it got worse as she got closer to the house. It was hard to see through the windows because they were curtained with flies. They opened the door and were basically smacked in the face with flies and death, so they let it stand open for a while before entering. When they finally did, they saw what was literally just a puddle of flesh, bones and clothing underneath a hanging noose. I think the body had been there several weeks. The story was something like, an old man lived there and had basically been estranged from his family. His only child lived in LA or something, and it wasn't rare to not speak for several months at a time. Very sad and incredibly unfortunate, but this happens more than we know. Military here. I was working on the flight deck of a carrier and we had a guy get hit by some propellers. Killed instantly. They gathered what they could, all the scattered chunks of flesh and bone from him, and put it in a bag, then 30 seconds later rolled up with the pressure washer, and sprayed what's left of him into the sea. We went right back to launching and catching jets less than 5 minutes after cleanup wash finished. I understand why we did it, but still a little harsh to see and process. I used to date a guy who worked for a body removal service. One man was found, in a state of decay, to have been choked by some sort of homemade pulley choking system in his bedroom. He had a sex toy in his rear, so it looked like autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong. Be safe out there, guys. Choke with a friend. I don't know if this is his most disturbing case, but it stuck with me. Another disturbing pickup he did was when a small car was following too close behind a semi-truck on the expressway. The truck stopped fast and the smaller car got stuck under the truck and was dragged for long enough to catch fire. The man in the small car burned to death, and died as he was trying to climb out of his window, to jump into traffic from a speeding, burning car. I assume all of this sort of work is disturbing, but what a mercy to be able to die in your sleep. I heard this on a podcast. It was a man who owned a small business dedicated to cleaning up death. One of his first jobs he was sent to was an old single-family home to clean up. It was dark in there, and he only had his flashlight. Out of nowhere he hears this noise that sounded like someone was grinding meat. He couldn't figure where it was coming from. Anyway, as he keeps looking around, the sound gets louder and louder and finally makes his way to the kitchen, where the body of an 80-plus-year-old man is lying. The noise? Maggots were consuming his head slowly. He had been diseased for about 4 days. He ran outside and threw up. In an interview, he still does the job. Much respect for the man. This guy's kid was born on Christmas Day, so they had Christmas and birthday party. Naturally he was drunk as a skunk and collided with a tree on the way home. The holidays are hard for a lot of people anyway, but imagine every birthday and Christmas Day is the anniversary where your dad died because he was celebrating your birthday. I'm not a responder, but I have a story. The smell still haunts me to this day. Background. When I was a senior in high school, I helped a new older gentleman of our church move into his home with a few others. My church has a pretty good system of looking out for the well-being of other members, and I would occasionally check on him. It turned out that he needed a quadruple bypass surgery and didn't have any close family, so he legally named 18-year-old me the executor of his estate. Surgery goes fine. I moved out later that year and he moved out of state and we lost communication. 5 years later I get a call from his landlord. Apparently we had both moved back to the same area without knowing it. The landlord told me that he had died and they found his will and my name still listed as executor. This 6-foot-tall, 300-pound man died in his recliner in the summer. No one knew he had died for over 2 weeks. The landlord discovered him and said he basically just melted to the chair. After they removed his body, it was now my responsibility to handle his belongings and get them removed from the property. The smell still haunts me to this day. I remember seeing a story where cleanup workers went to go pick up an elderly lady that died. When they got there they saw the cat eating the top of her face. I believe they said the nose and upper lip was gone. Turns out she wasn't dead. Just had a stroke and was paralyzed from the neck down or something. She felt everything apparently. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more disturbing videos like this one. Kudos to the guys that have to do this job. Share your thoughts about these stories in the comments below. Warning: this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. He was then cooking on his water bed for over 3 months, which essentially turned him into decomposing human soup. Crime scene cleaners or investigators, what's the most messed up thing you've seen at work? My best friend's dad was called to the home of a family that used to force their retarded son to rape their daughter when she was bad. He found her naked in a closet with her hands tied. She spent the first 7 years of her life in a closet naked. She had never worn clothes before. She was put in foster care and my aunt and uncle ended up adopting her. So she became my cousin of sorts. She was always very scared but sweet. I remember the first time we were introduced she asked me, "Do you love me?" And I looked at my mom and she gave me this look like, "You better say yes or I will whip your butt," so I did. We were both about 7 or 8 at the time. She never matured past the mind of a child though. She wasn't born with any mental issues but the neglect and abuse messed her up. The company I work for doesn't usually clean up crime scenes, but it's something my boss has been trying to get into for a while. We have gone and done a couple of bits. Usually when we show up the crime scene is over a week old, sometimes 2. This one in particular, a man murdered his girlfriend and confessed the next day, so it was about 3 or 4 days old. This man stabbed his girlfriend 56 times throughout the home while she was trying to get away. He then stabbed her in the bathroom. There was blood and hair everywhere. That's not even the most messed up part. After she was dead, he cut off her boob and cooked it in a frying pan. Drugs were involved. My father was a cop and about 16 years ago he got a well-being call on Christmas. The neighbors hadn't heard from the family, a mother and her daughter, for a few days and they wanted someone to see what was up. My dad wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary and was shocked when he walked inside. The room was black and cold. There was a little girl sitting there staring at a wall with only blankness in her eyes. Beside her lay a naked woman covered in gashes and in a pool of her own blood. Turns out 3 days prior the mother's boyfriend was angry, I forget the reason, and he raped and killed the mother. The little girl, who was around 5 years old, was blind so she couldn't do anything but sit there. She hadn't eaten for 3 days and could only sit there, cry, and sleep. When I was a med student I spent a month observing at the NYC coroner's office. One day I got to go with the CSIs to a crime scene. It was at a woman's apartment in Midtown. Her boyfriend had shot her in the head before killing himself. They were both Russian, in their 30s. The messed up part, he had waited until they were in bed having sex to commit the murder and suicide. When we got there, they were still naked in bed, him on top of her, the gun still in his hand. They were also bloated and smelly, and covered with flies since it had been 4 days since they had died. Apparently one of the neighbors had heard the gunshot, knocked on their door, and walked in after finding it unlocked. When he saw the bodies he thought they were still having sex and walked right back out. So nobody was called about the crime until 4 days later when the smell made the neighbors call the police. The first suicide scene I walked into was memorable. A college student had duct taped a 12-gauge shotgun to his face. The ceiling was still dripping. The boy had duct taped the muzzle of the shotgun in position over one of his eyes. Before taping the scary end to his face, he had taped the grip to his hand with his finger on the trigger so he couldn't let go. He sat down in the bathroom and once all the tape was applied, he leaned back and slammed his body forward, striking the stock on the floor, which forced his finger to press the trigger. Sadly this was all pre-planned. We found the note in his bedroom. An unexpected, probably, effect of the tape around his head was that it did a very good job of keeping his head intact. Other than the fist-sized exit wound in the back of his head, the skull was held together. Also, if you're having thoughts of suicide, please talk to someone. You are not alone, and people do care about you. I have seen too many families ruined by the suicide of a loved one. You are valued, you are loved, and there is always a way out. My friend is a former Chicago police officer. He told me of this one crime scene he had to go to where the guy was murdered on his kitchen floor and left for 2 weeks before anybody called about it. He was already a larger guy and he had bloated to be at least twice the size. When him and his partner tried to flip him over, the skin that had been touching the tiles were stuck and caused it to completely tear apart. His insides just came gushing out of him and they both ran out because the smell was too intense. I know this is a little different, but still pretty messed up. My best friend and mother is a property manager and she found really screwed up stuff in one of her homes. A 30 to 40-year-old woman and her Down syndrome son rented out one of the houses for 2 or 3 years and then suddenly disappeared without any notice. She was a lawyer by profession and seemed normal, so my friend's mother trusted not to visit the home for the time period. The woman always said she did her own repairs and such, so there was no reason for concern. However, after lack of payments, my friend's mother went to investigate and found a lot of scary stuff. For example, one of the rooms was completely clear of furniture. However, there were small chains screwed into the wall where she kept her son. The walls had severe markings where the son apparently scraped with his fingernails and banged on the walls. He never went to school. According to the neighbors, they'd hear her leave the house while he was screaming but just assumed that he was acting out. I used to work at a family-owned funeral home. I was about 19 years old at the time. We did home pickups on the bodies a lot of times. There was this one guy who had been dead in his apartment for I don't know how long. But when we walked in, the room was filled with flies. Picture the movie The Mummy where a wall of flies shoots out of his mouth. It was sort of thin at first, but as you got closer there was a thick wall where the density and the flies skyrocketed. We were wearing full body suits, so no worries. It was just like something out of a movie. The body was what you would expect. Also had a guy who died in the seat of his car in his driveway. He died holding on to the wheel and rigor mortis set in, so he wasn't letting go. To get him off, I had to bend each finger back. It would crackle like the bones were breaking as I did it. Had to do it slowly to keep from doing too much damage. While doing it I had the dead guy's face right next to mine since he was slouching over. I almost forgot, how could I, when bodies are autopsied, the people who perform the autopsy will send the body to the funeral home without putting them back together. This means the chest and stomach is cut open, rib cage comes in a separate box, organs come in plastic bags, scalp and face cut off but flapped back over the skull. We got in the autopsied body one night and it was really late, so we leave it in the building and we'll fix him up the next day. We come in the next day and there must have been a crack in a wall somewhere or something, but ants found their way in. The body was laying there, chest wide open, mouth and eyes open, covered in ants. There wasn't a single place on the body that wasn't covered in ants. They were crawling in and out of his ribcage, in and out of his nose, mouth, and eyes. We just took a spray bottle of ant killer and sprayed the body down and then washed it off when they all died and fixed it up like normal. My dad's a cop. When I was about 10 I was at his office and he was going through his desk showing me and my mom pictures he found in his desk. Most of them were from one of the Woodstock music festivals he worked and people that he met over the years. Then he opened a manila envelope, and I found myself staring at a photo of a pretty dark-haired woman's head and neck close up. Except her throat was sliced. For some ungodly reason my dad continues going through these pictures. Turns out that the manila envelope contained the crime scene photos of a double homicide. Guy's wife sleeps with her boss, guy kills her boss, with a gun at a different location, and then finds his wife. The first photo he showed me was from the actual scene. The woman's eyes and mouth were wide open and her face was covered in blood. You couldn't see too much around her neck due to the blood, but her head was tilted back an unnatural amount. More photos showed blood splattered all around the house, indicating a very obvious struggle. Other photos showed slice marks on the outside of her forearms, which are very common in knife attacks because the victim usually puts their arms up to protect themselves. One main detail I remember is one of her vessels had fallen out of her arm and it looked like a long hollow spaghetti noodle. The blood on it looked like spaghetti sauce too. The next set of photos was from the coroners and all the blood was cleaned off of her. Now that I think about it, the first boobs I've ever seen may very well have been this dead chick's. Weird. Anyway, I digress. She's all cleaned off and you can see clear down her neck. Real freaky shit seeing all the big vessels, trachea, esophagus. The whole 9 yards. She also had multiple stab wounds in her torso, back and legs, but they didn't look that disgusting, just little slits. Her arms were gnarly though, as I said before they still looked like spaghetti noodles, minus the sauce. Also you could see some muscle in her bone in one. I think that was back when my dad was a homicide detective. He's been a cop for over 30 years and has been a patrol trooper, on the Scuba Rescue, Mobile Response Team, SWAT, Homicide, and Undercover Narcotics, among other things.
You don't know it, but you leave your shower covered in chemicals. Big Soap says they don't use enough of this stuff to cause damage, but why play just the tip with harmful?
Not a cleaner, but my jobs takes my upstairs to the medical examiner's office every now and then. The two worst bodies I have seen are a guy who was shot and then had his trailer set on fire to try and hide the evidence. The smell of charred human flesh is nothing you'll ever forget, or want to smell again. Only his extremities got burned, and his central torso was still mostly unburned so the projectiles could be recovered with minimal damage. A woman who was bludgeoned to death by her ex-boyfriend, who then chopped her body up into 6 pieces and scattered the parts around the county. When I walked in, one medical examiner was holding her head up by the hair while another was drawing eye fluid. They had the whole body laying out in proper orientation on the examination table. The thing about this one didn't hit me until later, I don't remember how long, when I was watching a horror movie. All of the fake dismembering of body parts looked pretty dead on what I saw in the medical examiner's office that day, so Hollywood actually makes some believable gore sometimes. My mom is a hairstylist and is sometimes asked to do the hair for corpses before the funeral. She said the worst one she had to do was a little 7-year-old girl. The girl had been walking along train tracks. When she tripped, she got hit, basically just removing the back of her head. She looked fine besides the giant gaping hole in the back of her head. They had cleaned it all up and packed the hole a little, so it wasn't so bad looking. Medic here saw aftermath of a guy who walked into his front yard and shot himself in the head with a pistol. Would have been dead except that he had a pacemaker. Blood was squirting from the exit or entrance wound, not sure which, and there was white matter all over the head of my stretcher. I learned why it was nicknamed the brain catcher that day. My partner tells a story about a drunk who wandered into the street and fell down. Car ran over the guy's head, crushing. Cranium was empty. He followed the trail about 20 feet and found an intact brain. Must have popped out somehow and soared the distance. My cousin bought this old house years ago, for cheap. The story goes the owner, an older large hermit-type fellow, died in front of the oven with it on full blast. A few weeks later, I believe, the neighbors couldn't stand the stink coming from inside the house. The guy literally melted through the floor and into the floor joists. Cousin managed to rid the house of the smell only by removing every piece of wood the guy's remains touched. Real estate agents were selling the house as property only. Not a CSI, but here goes. My mom inherited a very upscale home in Florida from her dad, and since we lived in CA, she hired a property manager in Palm Beach to find some decent renters. The rent was pretty high and prospective tenants had to go through a background check and put down a large security deposit in the hopes we would find some reliable people. After a few months, they rented the place out to a couple of doctors and their wives who had just relocated to Florida from Ohio. Everything went well for about a year. The people paid their rent on time, no complaints from the neighbors, etc. They gave notice that they were moving out, and when the property managers came in to inspect the place, oh dear God, the place had been completely destroyed. Huge holes in the walls, countertops that looked like they had been set on fire, carpet ripped up, light fixtures removed, and in the master closet, piles and piles of blood-saturated sheets. We called the cops, who suggested that the doctors were running some kind of makeshift surgery clinic out of my mom's house. The doctors disappeared, never to be found, and my mom decided to cut her losses and sold the house. I saw a case of arson once where the house of a man who was in a wheelchair was set on fire. The image of the man, charred with the metal in his chair having essentially fused itself to his body with a screaming expression on his face, will haunt me for the rest of my life. So will the smell. Secondly, I was at a crime scene where a man had his 6-year-old son stab another guy in the neck for a case of beer. Told his son to stick him like a pig. I'll always remember later that night at the police station later on, while the father was being interviewed, the child was sitting in the hallway, covered in the blood of a man that he had just murdered, playing with a teddy bear. Thirdly, I'll never forget the time I found the raped and murdered body of a 16-year-old girl who had been beaten to death with the bottom end of a beer bottle until her skull caved in, her nipples bitten off, and left in a field wearing nothing but an unzipped windbreaker. Killed by her boyfriend's brother because she wouldn't have sex with him. Eventually, I gave up on humanity, quit that line of work. Not my story, but told to me by an old high school coach that used to work for the police. He was called to a house for a wellness check on a lady that was described as 35 years old, white and around 120 pounds. They knocked on the door to no answer and eventually went in. They found a dead woman laying on a bed upstairs, only it wasn't the lady they were there to find. This woman was black and looked as if she weighed 300 plus pounds. They called for the team that removes dead bodies from places. While they were waiting, they searched some more and found a purse next to the bed, and it was the license of the white woman they had been called on to check in on. It turns out, the 300-pound woman on the bed was the white woman. She had been dead for a few weeks and had decomposed into a blob of decaying flesh. The worst part is, that as the team that removes bodies prepared to move the body onto the floor and into a body bag, he was told to leave the room if he didn't want to get sick. Not heeding the good advice, he stood by as they proceeded to move the body. She exploded. Like a big blister ready to pop, bodily fluids everywhere. He said he couldn't get the smell out of his mustache for days and eventually just shaved it. Years later I heard he had taken his own life, and I can't help but think this situation and others like it contributed to his decision to do it. One of my old co-workers told me about a scene he had to clean up. He arrived before the crime scene investigators had finished doing all their work. There was a chair in an empty room with one fireplace. Tied the chair's legs were the lower legs of the house owner's wife. No other body parts were on the chair. And resting on the fireplace mantel was the wife's head. Blood everywhere from the dismemberment. The torso and arms were laying around the room. He quit after this particular job not because it scared him or anything, but because the company he worked for was cheap and only paid him $100 for 3 hours of cleaning blood and body parts from the room. I grew up with two brothers that were about 18 months apart in age, but because of how the birthdays fell, we're only 1 grade apart. The younger brother was in my grade and the older brother a year above, but we all ran in the same group of friends. Their dad was a deacon in the church, coached our little baseball and football teams, was the PA announcer for years at all of our high school football and baseball games. He was well known by everybody. Anyway, one of our other friends' dad was a cop. During college, the father of my buddies called the cop dad and asked him to come over without really saying anything else. The cop dad shows up to find the garage taped off with plastic sheets, like a scene from Dexter, and the father dead in the garage. He had sent his wife out for errands, prepped everything so the cleanup would be as easy as possible, called the cop dad, then shot himself in the head. All because of an affair. One of the worst jobs I ever did was a suicide. A 10 feet deep concrete pit in the ground covered up with boards. The man used a shotgun and had been in the pit for almost 3 weeks liquefying. His wife had asked us to perform the job as